the aim is to talk about flourishing as the aim of education. So most of you obviously are fairly familiar with the general discourse on flourishing in philosophy and psychology, especially those of you working in the flourishing program at Harvard. That's obviously the bread and butter of what you are thinking about every day. So I don't think I can sort of contribute much to your understanding of flourishing in that broad philosophical context, but I'm hoping to be able to give you some overview of the way in which this discourse has been playing out in educational circles in the last 5 to 10 years, when a lot has been happening. So I will be basing a lot of what I say on my 2020 book, Flourishing as the Aim of Education, but I go beyond it in various ways in this presentation. For example, I identified 10 problems that I still think remain even after this book was written. And then also a lot has been happening in educational circles in the last 2 or 3 years regarding flourishing, and my talk will reflect that. So already this 2020 book is in many ways outdated. So I'll try to speak for not more than 45 minutes, so we have some time for Q&A. And I've already shared my slides with Wojciech and Tyler, so if anybody is interested in getting a copy of the slideshow, then email either Wojciech or just myself, and I can forward the slides to you. Just for those of you who don't know where I'm coming from, so I work in the Jubilee Center for Character and Virtues at the University of Birmingham, on the top floor of this building you see on the right. And we are a large sort of Aristotelian research center with 15 to 20 members of staff. We produce a lot of materials on character and virtues and human flourishing. We also started a secondary school in Birmingham, which is extremely popular. It's the most highly subscribed state school in the city, which is centered around the ideals of flourishing and character. And we also run the world's only fully online master's program in character education, where we take in about 50 students per year, and 25 of those are fully funded students from the USA, funded by the Cohen Family Foundation. So if you know about any students who would like to do an online master in character education and are living in the USA, then by all means notify them of the possibility of getting full scholarship from the Cohen Family Foundation. Right, so more to the point, a lot has been happening in education in the last 5 to 10 years regarding the ideal of flourishing. It's become in a way a new paradigm in educational circles, especially in the English-speaking world. So you can see this on both sides of the pond. For example, in the States, eminent educationist Harry Brickhouse talks about the purpose of education being to promote human flourishing. In the UK, John White, sort of a grand old man of educational philosophy in the UK, sees schools above anything else as seedbeds of human flourishing. And in the Netherlands, Dorette de Ruiter focuses on the universal hopes of parents that their children lead a flourishing life. But here's the first problem. Obviously, the ideal of flourishing dates back to Aristotle's eudaimonia. But actually, most of the people who are vocal in this field in education are not Aristotelians, but would define themselves as liberal educationists, and that applies to all these three: Brickhouse, White, and de Ruiter. Now, this creates some issues because there is actually quite a big gap between the general Aristotelian philosophy and liberal philosophy. For example, regarding the idea of common human virtues or values, where the Aristotelians sort of usually follow Aristotle in believing that, as he said himself, the more we travel, the more we see how similar human beings are and their values, whereas obviously liberals, they make do with a much narrower set of common human values, often confined to things like property rights and liberty and tolerance, whereas the fundamental Aristotelian virtue is practical wisdom or phronesis. And then, in addition to these liberals and Aristotelians, we've got two other camps. In psychology, also promoting this idea of flourishing in education, namely both self-determination theory and positive psychology, or what Martin Seligman often refers to nowadays as positive education. So positive education, as for example promoted in his 2011 book Flourishes, is all about flourishing as an educational ideal. So the second problem is, so if all these groups are talking about flourishing, do they really mean the same thing? And is there the use of a common language worrisome? So I'll be returning to this issue later when I talk about the problem of vacuity or blandness or banality in sort of applying this concept. And this has happened since I wrote my 2020 book. We certainly see this incredible interest in policy circles about educational flourishing from educational policymakers. And interestingly enough, the motivation for this interest comes from the countries that tend to score highest in the international PISA comparisons, the annual PISA comparisons organized by OECD. So namely South Korea, Finland, and Singapore. I mean, these are the countries that are pressurizing OECD into changing the PISA comparisons and adding some kind of human flourishing measure. So not only measuring sort of language skills and science skills, but also having some kind of an international comparison of flourishing. Because I mean, the Singaporeans and the South Koreans say that, well, no matter how high we score annually in your comparisons, our students are not happy in general, and there's a very high suicide rate among teens and so on. So they are pressurizing OECD into doing something about that, and OECD is running a big conference in Singapore at the end of this month, a 3-day conference, sort of talking about the possibility of changing their instruments. And we have these 2 recent reports published this year, one by UNESCO and the other by Michael Stevenson, sort of on behalf of OECD, talking about this in sort of policy language. These are not, I mean, especially the Stevenson report is maybe not very deep philosophically, but he talks about all these policy issues. And Michael is a very interesting character. He used to be the main education correspondent for BBC for many years, but now he's working sort of both freelance and for OECD. And OECD has commissioned at least four reports to be delivered next year about human flourishing as an educational aim, and I'm supposed to be writing one, and Tyler is writing another one about the instruments, and then there are 2 other reports also under construction. Now I will go very quickly through this slide because, I mean, especially for those of you working at Harvard, I mean, this is obviously, like I said, bread and butter for you, and you all know that flourishing accounts belong to what I usually call the objective accounts of well-being. And you are aware, obviously, of this distinction between subjective and objective accounts, understand that objections lodged against each of them. So I think this is sort of stuff for newcomers to the field, and there's nothing new here, I think. So this is just a reminder of the taxonomy, the standard taxonomy of what a flourishing account is in general, and the same would apply to flourishing accounts of education. So very, very quickly, if I look at these 4 Western accounts, these main 4 Western accounts competing for allegiance in the education field, I mean, I think they've all got their pros and cons. So one of the things I'm trying to do in the book, I tried to do in the 2020 book, although it's written from an Aristotelian perspective, is to sort of incorporate the insights from the 3 other accounts and to aim at some kind of a synthesis. So I think the original Aristotelian account is really strong on the idea of flourishing as an inherently moral and rational, but emotionally sort of informed activity in a community. But obviously there are problems with the Aristotelian account if we want to modernize it, because it doesn't pay attention to individual purpose and meaning, or things like autonomy and authenticity, these simply because these concepts didn't exist in ancient Greece. Neither to transcendent experiences like awe and elevation. Aristotle was sort of running scared away from Plato's idealism and didn't want to have anything to do with transcendent experiences at all. Now, the liberal accounts are obviously as liberal accounts tend to be in every field, strong on autonomy, on individual purpose, meaning, authenticity, etc. But they do not really say much about, universal character strengths and virtues, apart from these sort of very thin liberal values were presided over by tolerance. Self-determination theory, I'm both talking about Ryan and DC there, and also Randy Curran, who has been a philosopher who has been writing stuff with them on flourishing. Obviously, as always, are very strong on the psychological needs motivating flourishing, the needs for competence and autonomy and relationships. But they do not write much about sort of flourishing as an embodiment of human rational capacities. And finally, Martin Seligman and his colleagues in positive psychology, they are strong on the issues that the Aristotelians are weak on, namely the self-transcendent experiences of awe and elevation, and also on personal meaning. So these are the PM variables from Seligman's PERMA model. But from a philosophical point of view, their normative grounding is not very strong. They sort of rely only on what is universally deemed, is universally valued, not what is universally valuable. So they try to evade all questions of moral ontology. And they don't have any sort of moral integrator like phronesis. So they don't really take much notice of virtue conflicts, which Aristotelians tend to be obsessed with. So Aristotelians spend more time on sort of thinking about how to solve virtue conflicts between, let's say, honesty and loyalty than on any other things in moral theorizing, whereas that doesn't seem to be a problem for positive psychologists. Now, so like I said earlier, I mean, in my 2020 book, which is already a bit outdated, I try to aim for some kind of a synthesis. Obviously, my starting point is neo-Aristotelian. I say a lot about character strengths and virtues, like obviously Tyler does in his 2017 article, which has become a mini classic. But I also try to accommodate insights from positive psychology, especially regarding these enchanted, transcendent experiences, and also from liberalism about autonomy and personal purpose. And then I do suggest some problems, but I don't really try to solve them in the book. So I'm continuing to work on many of those now. Now, this is one consideration when I, in my 2020 book, or when Tyler in his 2017 article talks about the need to synthesize accounts of flourishing and aim for some kind of a conciliatory account, we tend to be focusing on these Western approaches, like these four I mentioned already. But then obviously people in the East, and remember that's where the motivation is coming now, which is pressurizing OECD. I mean, the people in Singapore and South Korea and China, I mean, they obviously ask, what about the Eastern approaches to flourishing? Don't we have to account for them as well? Buddhism, Confucianism, or even the African Ubuntu philosophy. So do these offer radically different and possibly incompatible insights? So I ran actually an interesting webinar last week, which is available on the web already, and this was sort of commissioned by OECD as well. They asked me to run this webinar on getting insights from Buddhists and experts on Confucianism and Ubuntu. So we had really interesting presentations there, for example, by Owen Flanagan from Duke, and all available for you to watch if you're interested. But unfortunately, this is not something that I have given much thought to or gave much thought to in my 2020 book. Now, just a quick caveat. I mean, some people think that the distinction between objective and subjective accounts of well-being is pretty useless or sort of OTOs, because these two things will always go hand in hand, or at least in most cases go hand in hand. That the people who is flourishing, which is also going to be subjectively happy, and subjective happiness is a fundamental indicator of flourishing. And now, while I think there is empirical evidence for the correlation between these two I think it's too simple to say that these are just two sides of the same coin. And in my book, I give examples, for example, of Wittgenstein, who on his own account, on his deathbed, led an extremely flourishing life, but seems to have been a grumpy and sort of, unhappy person most of the time. I mean, his glass was always half empty, according to his friend, rather than half full. And then the other example is of Gauguin, who seemed to sort of really enjoy himself and lead a happy hedonistic life in Polynesia, sort of, flirting with all the local girls and having fun, while his family was starving back home in the Netherlands. So it would be really, really difficult, at least from an Aristotelian perspective, to say that Gauguin was leading a flourishing life, but he seemed to have had quite an enjoyable sort of existence. So I think simply this creates a problem if you want to argue that the distinction between flourishing and subjective happiness is worthless or doesn't matter. And then there is a problem of bluntness or banality. And I think this is a threat that hovers constantly over educational accounts of flourishing, including positive education. And we recently sort of had a very, very detailed account of this objection in David Carr's 2021 piece on what is educational virtue in flourishing, and I'll mention this a bit later. So the worry there is that the concept of flourishing, at least in education, becomes like a shopping trolley that everybody can fill with just a random choice of goods. And the variables in the definition are not really generally populated with sufficient specificity to prevent the account from being just completely blunt and any sort of hypothesis based on it becoming undisconfirmable. And obviously, obviousness in an account is not only a cause of wariness, it dissipates salience as well. So in the book, I tried to do something similar to what maybe Tyler was attempting to do in his 2017 article, or that was sort of a more general account of flourishing, whereas I was obviously focusing more on flourishing in an educational context. So I gave this sort of really compressed and compressed but complex definition of human flourishing. I'm not going to read it aloud. I was told recently by an eminent colleague that this sounds like the small letters in an insurance contract. So I don't dare to read this out, but this was sort of an attempt to capture most of the variables that you would want to see, at least in a neo-Aristotelian account of human flourishing. And then in the book, I try to spell out each of these variables with examples and offer food for thought for teachers and other educators. So in the book, although the book is sort of written more for academics than for practitioners, I tried to make it as readable as I possibly could. And I end every chapter with some questions and some food for thought for teachers and other educators. So I think my complex definition is fairly similar to Van der Wiel's famous 5 domains. We could sort of compare them, put them side by side, and you would see a lot of overlaps, except perhaps that in my account, I don't count subjective happiness as part of flourishing. For me, it's a kind of a byproduct of flourishing, or the icing on the cake, rather than part of the concept. But apart from that, these synthetic accounts of flourishing are pretty similar. Now, my colleagues in philosophy sort of accuse me of not being Aristotelian enough, and sort of being too conciliatory in the book. So they would say, well, you say this is a neo-Aristotelian account of flourishing, but actually it's not, because you go beyond Aristotle in various ways. And I do. I mean, like I said, the book was aiming for a synthesis rather than just a development of an Aristotelian account. So I do argue in the book that flourishing in an educational context involves engagement with self-transcendent ideals, and that they ignite awe-filled enchantment in ways that go well beyond and even clash with traditional Aristotle-inspired conceptions of eudaimonia. Like I said earlier, I mean, his he was committing his famous academic patricide on Plato by sort of not focusing on attraction to abstract ideals. And I also allow for moral elevation and radical gestalt switches, sort of psychomoral conversions of the kinds that are bound to appear alien to orthodox Aristotelians, because obviously Aristotle didn't believe in people undergoing radical character changes, especially not those who were brought up in very bad habits as children. On the other hand, my conception is more demanding than Aristotle, for example, by accommodating some liberal insights about flourishing having to include a clear personal sense of meaning. Obviously, Aristotle had a clear conception of the human telos, but that's the general human telos. I mean, I don't think he would have really understood what liberals mean by sort of authentic, autonomous idea of your identity. So are standard accounts of flourishing too flat and too disenchanted? I do think they are. I mean, I think this is a problem. This is a serious problem, especially with Aristotelian derived accounts. I mean, he doesn't really take account of the fact that in addition to being rational, we are also spiritual and creative beings responsive to beauty. Without awareness of which any account of human being becomes deflated. He talks a lot about wonder, but that's really just curiosity. It's intellectual curiosity. He doesn't really talk about awe as a self-reflexive virtue. And that's because he doesn't think that we are really attracted to the ideals of the true good and the beautiful in our lives. That doesn't really, not in any sort of meaningful way, what we are attracted to are true, good and beautiful people. He was a people person, after all. Now, I'm not saying that we need some kind of a religious element to an account of flourishing, but I think we need some kind of a spiritual dimension to it, and spiritual possibly in a non-religious sense. So in this way, I think, so I mean, just to sort of make a brief note to the Eastern accounts, I think the Confucian accounts are, although very similar to Aristotelian accounts in many ways, are stronger in that respect than Aristotle, because of Confucius's focus on aesthetic appreciation and you know, his abstract ideals of heaven and the way. So I try to explain in the book what's a problem in Aristotle regarding this sort of awe element, the missing awe element, and I think the problem lies in his emotion theory. When you look at the emotion that he describes, and they look at the targets, they are targeted towards oneself, like pride, to other people, like compassion, or to external events like fear and wonder, but they're not attracted, they don't have as their targets ideals or idealizations such as beauty, truth, and goodness in the abstract. So to couch this in the language of sort of 20th century psychology, I mean, there is no space in Aristotle for the top of Maslow's pyramid, the peak experiences of transcendence. Now, in the book, I like I said, I'm trying to be very conciliatory. So I'm saying, well, actually, we might get some help there from positive psychology. We might get some help from the focus on the P&M in the PERMA model, the positive emotions, which include appreciation of beauty and excellence and the virtue of transcendence, and also awe and elevation, and obviously from the M, the meaning element as well. So to bring the discussion into sort of a more practical domain, then the question arises: what should teachers do about enchantment? I mean, if we really believe that sort of transcendent experience is a part of human flourishing, especially human flourishing in an educational context, what can teachers do to help students experience these peak experiences? Which unfortunately empirical research seems to indicate they hardly ever experience, even in classes in art and literature and physics, where you would expect all these sort of transcendent experiences to happen. And I argue in the book that teachers need to expose students to experiences where they're most likely to come into contact with these ideals of truth, beauty, and goodness. And I take examples, for example, both from science teaching about the universe and the teaching of great literature. I spent quite a lot of time in the book talking about this transcendental urge as being part of a good human functioning. I also spent considerable time talking about student meaning, personal meaning, the creation of sort of personal purpose or personal identity, which obviously is a liberal idea. It goes back to the Enlightenment, not something that Aristotle would have really understood, I think. And I draw a lot there on William Damon's work, his 2008 book on The Path to Purpose, which I strongly recommend to those of you who haven't read it, and his extensive research with young people in the States between the ages of 12 to 26, which seems to indicate that only 20% of the interviewees were fully purposeful. Most of them either didn't have any clear purpose or meaning behind their education or their life in general, or they were dabblers and dreamers. One of the strong elements in Aristotle's account of flourishing as an educational ideal, and this relates to Tyler's sixth domain, the material necessities, the resources. Obviously, there's a lot of emphasis in Aristotle about the creation of the necessities that help people to flourish, and he distances his view very, very strongly from the view of Socrates, that nothing can harm the good person. If you're just good, then you will flourish. Doesn't matter what else is happening to you. I mean, if you're being locked up or tortured or whatever. And the same argument would sort of also hit at Confucianism and Stoicism and Buddhism. So Aristotle, who usually is very, very moderate in his use of words, actually uses the word nonsense there. He says that this view that we can just flourish just if we are morally good, irrespective of all external circumstances, is just nonsense, he says. And he doesn't really provide much of a further argument. He just thinks that for all rational people, this is the nonsensical view. And he talks about all these preconditions that we need to have to flourish. And sometimes he's not very clear on whether these are sort of preconditions of flourishing or constitutive parts of flourishing. He often doesn't make a clear distinction, for example, regarding health, whether health is a precondition of flourishing or part of flourishing, or both. Now, if that's true, I mean, if educational flourishing requires a lot of external necessities, then again, the question that teachers need to ask themselves, what should we do about this? And we know at least 20% of children in the world do not have these external necessities to flourish at school. They don't even have any school to go to. And it's really interesting how sort of different people in this field have got radically different views on this. So I contrast in the book the views of Elizabeth Campbell, the Canadian educationist, with the view of Alistair McIntyre. And Elizabeth thinks that teachers do not really have any strong moral obligation in this area, that their main obligation is just towards the class they are teaching. I mean, they need to make sure that the class they're teaching is flourishing, but they have no sort of further sort of universal obligations to contribute to the flourishing of all the children in the world. Whereas Alistair McIntyre believes that teachers should be agents of social change and fight for educational opportunities for all. If you have a vocation as a teacher, then you're not only concerned about your class, but you're concerned about all children in the world, all pupils in the world. But he says that the hope that we can create these conditions for everybody in today's capitalist world is just not, it's never going to happen. So this is why he talks about teaching as a forlorn, tragic profession, has a very, very pessimistic view of teaching. Apart from one short period during the Scottish Enlightenment, when he says teachers were really respected and listened to. So in this book, I mean, I often do as an Aristotelian, I try to offer a middle ground position where teachers need to make their voices heard about the interest of children all over the world, whereas not necessarily becoming social activists of the kind that Campbell presents. And then to become even more practical, right, so if we subscribe to this view of education as the ultimate goal of, as flourishing as the ultimate goal of education, and if OECD sort of writes this into its definition of, good world education, how much curricular change is really needed? I mean, how much would change in the way that teachers go about their business on a daily basis? And this is, again, a big debate. I'm fairly modest in my views. I mean, I talk about considerable changes in the way teachers teach certain subjects, especially arts and the sciences. But I do not sort of promote a radical overhaul of the whole curriculum. But there are people who do, and John White, for example, is maybe the most radical of all these thinkers, and he thinks that actually, if you're really serious about this, I mean, if you're not just paying lip service to flourishing as an educational idea, if you mean something by it, if OECD means something by it, then what is needed is a complete overhaul of the curriculum in all schools around the world, all sort of primary and secondary education around the world. Because he says, I mean, if you look at the timetable in typical, elementary, high schools, then the timetable looks almost the same as it did in the 19th century, maybe with the addition of IT. Apart from that, I mean, it's the same subjects. And he says, I mean, the world today is not arranged around subjects, it's arranged around themes. So we need to completely change this, and children should come to school in the morning, Monday morning, and there should be a class on global warming, and there should be a class on war and peace, and themes, the themes that matter, and people nowadays, they work in a problem-based way rather than a subject-based way, and this has to be reflected in a flourishing school. So that's sort of White's fairly radical take on things. Now, the final problem I'll mention briefly is the question of, right, so if we really insist on education becoming the official goal of education, or flourishing become the official goal of education, are teachers ready for this role? And a lot of empirical evidence from all over the world, from Korea, from the States, from the UK, indicates that this is not the case. Teachers, when interviewed or surveyed, most of them, the majority of them, think they do not have the capacity or the education or the background to become sort of flourishing coaches. And they complain about lack of attention to normative issues in teacher training, and their own lack of moral language and moral identities. They say, I mean, if we are supposed to become some kind of flourishing teachers, especially if we are supposed to be character educators as well, then we have to be clear about our own character and moral identities. And Chris Higgins at Boston College observes in his great book about teacher training that we need to restore to its central place the flourishing of the practitioner as the first step in constructing some kind of a virtue ethics of teaching as revolving around flourishing. So in other words, before teachers can help students answer adequately the question of what kind of persons they want to become, then they had to be clear about how they answer those questions for themselves. Now, just like I said, I mean, there's so much going on in this area now, and in my 2020 book, I had to create all kinds of straw men and, devil's advocates to fight with, because I didn't really have the counter arguments so much. But since that has now changed, so we have this sort of really powerful article by David Carr, where he elaborates on the vacuity objection. He thinks all this flourishing talk in education is just sort of completely bland and vacuous and doesn't really mean anything. It's just one more way to sort of divert attention from what really matters. And this is an interesting piece, because David Carr is the grand old man of character education. I mean, and he has written more than probably anybody else about, the ideals of education being neo-Aristotelian, but now in his late 70s, he sort of is changing his mind about that. He thinks a lot of this character and flourishing stuff is just sort of empty words. And then we have 2 new chapters in a book which is coming out in 2023 and is actually edited by one of the attendees here today. There's a really interesting chapter by Harry Siegel, which elaborates on what he calls the missing argument objection. So the missing argument objection is the argument that we are talking about different ideals. We are talking about all kinds of different ideals, and we sort of put them all under the umbrella of flourishing. But what is missing, according to Siegel, is any argument that these ideals have got anything in common apart from the fact that we happen to like them. There is nothing particularly sort of unified or specifically educational about them. And then Michael Hand sort of offers a kind of a version of this same argument, but it's more about what happens in the classroom. So he says that, I mean, a lot of the stuff that I am writing about or Tyler is writing about, I mean, these are not all nice things, and these are all important ideals, health and flourishing, but many of the things that we talk about as ingredients in flourishing cannot be taught or learned. That these are not sort of topics for educational practice. These are much bigger ideals for politicians to deal with, and for health professionals and so on. So he thinks that a lot of the stuff that I've been talking about cannot be taught and hence cannot be learned, and that we are sort of confusing a philosophical account of flourishing with an account of flourishing in educational context, which needs to be much more practical and down to earth and much more narrow. So like I said, the knives are finally coming out. So the people are sort of crawling out of the rabbit holes, and we've got lots of objections now to these accounts, which I had to make up previously. So this is the final slide. Call to arms. Until recently, flourishing was rarely discussed outside of a small echo chamber of Aristotelian philosophy. Then what happened to me at the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st, that lots of psychologists started to become interested in flourishing and started to write about it from a psychological perspective. And then even later on, this became a hot topic in education. So we know that the history of education is a history of fads which come and go. Is flourishing as an aim of education just one more fad? Well, maybe it becomes abortive, but other trends continue to grow and progress. So I sort of appeal to you to move the flourishing discourse in education forward if we are to make it truly enriching for educational policy and practice. Thank you.